Tell me what led up to your conversion, if you would, and why did you move away from Christianity or Buddhism or all the things that you were exposed to when you were
Well,
growing up?
I was in a head-on collision and survived a car accident that the California Highway Patrol said I shouldn't have survived. And I had what they call a near-death experience. I got very interested in what happens after you die. I realized that I could have very easily transitioned. And so I was very interested in what happens after death. I actually went and met with Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote the books on life after life. And he did a lot of the work with near-death people
Can I ask you what happened in your near-death experience?
I think it was pretty classic. You know, I definitely saw I went into a very different spatial temporal state where everything went into a kind of slow motion. And it was as if the glass was just suspended in air from the crash. And then I just saw like my inception all the way up to that moment.
What did that do for you, that experience? How did it change?
One, it made me, you know, at the time I was a senior in high school, my probably biggest interests were baseball and other things, but music was certainly a big interest. My family, I come from a family of musicians. So I think what it did is it made me really think about death in a very deep way. And if you've ever seen, there's a film about a man who's in a plane crash, and then he survives the plane crash. And it's a man who had a lot of fears, but he comes out of it. Jeff Bridges is the person, and he's like looking at his hands and, am I alive or am I dead? I was in that state for about 2 weeks. It was a very strange state to be in. And that got me interested in what religions say about after death.
So when you were 16 or 17, how old were you when you had the car accident? 17. So then you became interested in the issue of death and the meaning of death and the idea of preparation for death. And you read widely throughout the world's religions, and you said that Islam in particular struck your fancy. When did you convert? How old were you?
18.
Okay, so was that a radical move as far as your family was concerned?
You know, my dad, the first thing he did, he went to Gibbon and reread the section on the rise of Islam. My dad was a professor of philosophy, so, you know, he was a lapsed Catholic. Probably the most well-read person I've ever met in the Western canon. I think he was intrigued. He didn't really understand it. My mom was fine with it. She thought, great, you know, you found a path. That's how she viewed it. But both my parents ended up making the declaration of faith before they died. So my father read Ghazali and ended up becoming Muslim.
So what was it specifically about the Islamic treatment of death in the afterlife compared to, say, the Christian or Jewish treatment that attracted you?
The Quran is, the scent of death is on every page of the Quran. So it's definitely a very, very, it's a death reminder, and not in a negative way. There's this tension release that happens in the Quran. I was once in a hotel and in London, and there was a guy across from me reading the Quran, an English translation, and drinking a Heineken beer, which was very interesting. And so I was dressed in Western clothes, and I just asked him, "How are you finding that book?" He said, "This book is very interesting." And I said, "In what way?" And he said, "You know, it's just tension release. I said, "Wow, you got that on the first reading. That's very impressive." Because it's, you know, it'll tell you about all the wages of sin, but then it'll tell you about the blessings of obedience and turning to God and repenting and answering the call of the prophets, that perennial call that the prophets to shun false idols, including the idol of the self, to turn away from the vanities of life, the vain appetites that are of no use for you in this world.
Earlier, you talked about apparent and real goods. And so you're referring to that in a sense here again, and making the presumption that there is a hierarchy of values and that some things should be pursued in preference to others. And this is something that the modern West has great difficulty formalizing and accepting, although people suffer for it regardless of their understanding of it. When you are thinking about turning your eyes heavenward or getting your aim straight or obedience to God, what do you think, what does that mean to you conceptually, and what does it mean practically in your life?
Well, I mean, practically, it means staying within what we call the hudud. The Quran calls the limits that God has set on us. So we have certain limits that are set on us, and those limits are to protect us. So everything in the Islamic tradition, according to our Al-Ghazali and others, everything in our tradition is to protect one of six things: to protect religion itself, to protect human intellect, reason. So like the prohibition of alcohol is to protect human reason. To protect life, life is the next, to protect life, to protect human reason, to protect property, which is really what Richard Weaver called the last metaphysical right standing, the right to property. And then to protect family, and then to protect human dignity. So those six things, there's no ruling in Islam that isn't addressing one of those six preservations. And so everything that we do is for that's the way in which we try to live our lives.